Good afternoon, almost. Oh, we are 2 minutes early. Look at that. We are starting ahead of time. People will come in while we are already in progress. How cool is that?
Oh,
Welcome to Accomplices for Justice. Can you believe it, Pastor Hughes? We are episode 16.
that's insane.
And so I am Rabbi Jonathan Freirich. This is Reverend Dr. Wylie Hughes. We are Accomplices for Justice, or two in what we hope is many. And we are starting off this October with a series of three conversations focusing on what we might call how to live with more soul on the one hand, and maybe how to do so by capturing some of what liberalism has done for all of us already, which may mean jettisoning a whole lot of what we might call illiberalism on the left. Now, that's a mouthful and is a terrible, terrible soundbite, which is, in fact, the point of our book that we're going to come at in 2 weeks. So if you want more of that, liberalism is great and hard to explain type stuff. I urge everyone to pick up this very short and very wonderful book called A Thousand Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism by Adam Gopnik. Adam wrote this as a response to his daughter's upset in 2016 at seeing Donald Trump win the election.
Mm.
So it's a very interesting book, but it's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is the first in our series, and that's John McWhorter's Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. So I think, first of all, before we get into it, we are going to start by saying thank you, Professor McWhorter, for this title, and we're going to change it so that we can talk about it a little bit more proactively and a little less reactively. We're going to say maybe how a new orthodoxy or how a new fundamentalism has, and instead of saying betrayed, has not fully served Black Americans, or doesn't serve as well, or more importantly, doesn't always do what it says it's going to do.
I
How's
can get that.
how's that? All
I
right.
can get that. I can get that.
So to set us up, I'm bringing in yet a third book because, why not? So uh, this is a longer book, and I highly recommend it to everybody to find background on all that we're talking about this month. This is called The Identity Trap: A Story of Ideas and Power in Our Time by Yascha Mounk. And it describes the way by which liberalism became what he calls the identity synthesis, which is a way of saying instead of it being about universal values, it really has become about subjective individualism
Mm.
and who I am as a person and whether or not I'm deserving because of my unique personhood. Um,
Mm.
what what's called, and he picks on 7 ideas, but one of them is strategic essentialism, right? If we start out with the idea that in sort of 19th and early 20th century liberalism, that there are universal rights for everybody, that everybody should get the same thing, the same stuff, regardless of who we are. Uh,
Mm.
that sounds great. And then what we have in the late 20th century is but wait, we need to level the playing field.
Mm. Right.
And so suddenly my individual identity makes me more deserving than someone else's. And that is so who I am on the inside, who I am essentially, and how that's different. And what's very interesting is it takes things like, and McWhorter touches on this, the social construct of race,
Mm-hmm.
and turns it into something essential, right?
Right.
So somehow or another, while race is a social construct, I, you know, Wylie, Reverend Hughes, you have a direct experience of the fact that it doesn't matter how much of a social construct it is. It's a reality imposition on you that it isn't on me.
It is a reality. It is a reality.
So,
Even in its complexity.
right. So one of the challenges that we face is that in attempting to solve these problems, when we go out of complexity, we get into trouble. And
Right.
I think maybe we might look at McWhorter's critique in that way. And here is an example from Professor Monk's opening. He said he starts off with, in the late summer of 2020, Kiwa Posey asked the principal of Mary Lynn Elementary School in the wealthy suburbs of Atlanta whether she could request a specific teacher for her 7-year-old daughter. No worries, the principal responded at first. Just send me the teacher's name. But when Posey emailed her request, the principal kept suggesting that a different teacher would be a better fit. Eventually, Posey, who is Black, demanded to know why her daughter couldn't have her first choice. Well, the principal admitted, that's not the Black class. This story sounds depressingly familiar. It evokes the long and brutal history of segregation, conjuring up visions of white parents who are horrified at the prospect of their children having classmates who are Black. But there is a perverse twist. The principal, Sharon Briscoe, is herself Black. As Posey told the Atlanta Black Star, she was left in disbelief that I was having this conversation in 2020 with a person that looks just like me, a Black woman. It's segregating classrooms. You cannot segregate classrooms. You can't do it. What is going on, Reverend Hughes, that has gotten us to this place where suddenly it is the liberal progressive thing to segregate students so that they feel safe, so that they can perform better? What's going on?
Come on, you know what's going on. This has been going on from the beginning. This has been going on from the beginning. When whites were segregating schools back before Brown versus Board of Education, and even after, there was a reason for that. And so the reason is because they want to preserve their culture. They want to preserve their way of life. When whites wanted to preserve their way of life, they segregated their neighborhood, they segregated their schools, they segregated their businesses. And that same desire to preserve a particular way of life is prevalent today. This is just what Dr. King said, that the moderate, the liberal Christian is still the most dangerous part, because at the end of the day, they are going to do the same things that their conservative counterparts have done. We see segregation in schools even now. My issue is not so much Black people advocating for segregation of schools or classrooms.
Oh, we lost you there. Hold on. Something happened to your sound?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
All right. My issue is why is that an issue now when whites have been doing that for the past 20 years with the advent of charter schools? I'll give you an example.
Okay, so here's the question there. I'm letting Allison in. Welcome, Allison. Welcome, Tay. Welcome, Barbara. It's great to have you here. We will certainly unmute you at some point for questions. And yes, we are, of course, recording. So here's the thing. Your kids don't have the option for a Black class because they go to a majority white school, right?
Yes.
Are there any other Black students in your kids' school in Orchard Park?
Like 2.
Okay, so
Yeah.
in the entire school, forget in each
we're
grade,
talking about the entire school. Yeah.
right? So there's no opportunity for a Black class unless, your kids get individual tutoring the entire time. However, here we have colleges now setting up Black-only dorms at the request of African American studies professors and students.
But why is the question? Why are they doing that? Because the Black students at these predominantly white institutions are being harassed, they're being raped, they're being assaulted, they're being discriminated against. They want a safe space. Like,
wait. Okay. So McWhorter points out that students going to college report more racism in college than they did in high school.
oh yeah, oh yeah,
So
yeah.
what you're saying is that's the reality. That's not just, so McWhorter's position on this, and this is McWhorter's, please don't attack me for it, is that African American teens and teens of a variety of diverse backgrounds experience just as much racism and persecution in high school as they do in college. But when they arrive in college, the culture helps them identify it more
Yeah,
and, and
it helps you create a safe space.
know and creates a greater sensitivity because so his perspective is
Oh,
somehow
about
that
McWhorter. Yeah,
right, McWhorter's perspective is that African Americans are the subject of constant microaggressions and difficulties in high school for sure. But in college, suddenly those microaggressions and difficulties require safety that wasn't required in high school. And that in the pursuit of safety and and I can't tell you the venom in Reverend Denise Walden Glenn's voice when she hears the word safe space because she thinks it's a total fiction. She thinks there is no such thing as a safe space for for an African American in the United States in 2024. And so the idea of trying to create one is is hogwash. So that it's only the expectation of safety that creates the sense that there is more racism in college than there is in high school. So
ah, I have a problem with that. I have a
I
problem.
knew I knew you did, but I wanted to lay it out first.
I have a problem with that. Okay, I understand that. I understand the reality of quote unquote safe space. That it's not real. There's no such thing as a safe space. Well, I can 100%. I agree with that. I agree with that more than anything in the world right now. But the idea that one should not, especially a college student, shouldn't at least feel safer. I think we missed the point. I think, okay, if you don't want to call it a safe space, call it something else, but let's call it what it needs to be, an environment where people are allowed to grow and learn without an existential threat. Okay. And if we can agree that, and I've read so many stories about African American students at predominantly white institutions who who are harassed, who are just the racism is incredible. I remember reading an article, actually was on the news. A student from Atlanta was at Yale or Harvard, one of those Ivy League schools, and she had a roommate, a white roommate, and this particular black student was always getting sick. She was always sick with something. She was always not feeling well. She's trying to understand. Went to the doctor, and the doctor was like, "You have this. What's going on? There's something in your. What's happening? You have a culture in your mouth. Something's happening. There's bacteria. Where's this bacteria coming from? We don't know. If you can figure that out, we can sort this out." Come to find out, her roommate had been doing things with her toothbrush, putting it in certain places in her body, and then this person was brushing her teeth. And the roommate was was I'm trying to use a good internet friendly word. The roommate was putting things in her food, bodily fluids in her food, bodily fluids in her drink, because she really wanted this person to leave. And it came out. They put some, she left her cell phone camera running, and you could see that this roommate was literally harassing this girl. And so that kind of thing happens a lot. It happened to me when I went to school, and I went to school right down the street at Georgia State for my last 2 years of college, because I came from a historically black college, and I took the rest of my courses at Georgia State. And even I went through the same thing. Somebody broke into my car, and I watched them do it because they said that I had stole their book, a textbook. So, so there has to be something said about being a black student in a predominantly white environment, and having some kind of protection there. So
So these are what you just mentioned are much more egregious violations of someone's personhood than
yeah,
McWhorter does. So it seems like, and McWhorter is a professor. He's a professor in
yeah,
an Ivy League school.
yeah.
I feel like, he's as good a first person witness of what's going on or what's not going on at school. And uh, and my question to you, and let's admit that higher ed is off the deep end on any number of issues. Uh,
Yeah,
one of the things that Yasha Monk points out is that in the last 30 years, the number of classes, 30 or 40 years, the number of classes being taught has like doubled, tripled, quadrupled at universities. But the number of faculty have only increased by 60%.
right,
What's increased incredibly is administrators. And
right,
now we have administration outnumbering faculty. In fact, Yasha Monk quoted a statistic that there are more administrators at Yale than there are freshman students now.
right.
And
Right.
what are they doing? They're attempting to teach students. One of their platforms is attempting to get students to not do what you're talking about.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, and I think again, the violation of someone's personhood is different in scale than a microaggression. Although McWhorter says, and Yasha Monk says to a certain extent, that recognizing that the power of words is as damaging to a certain extent as the power of violence is
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. But again, a microaggression unchecked will lead to personal harm. If you don't check it, if the microaggressions are not checked, then they escalate, right?
So
You have to address them.
so here he writes, for example, that we need to there's one of his platforms, right, is that we have to support um Black students must be admitted to schools via adjusted grade and test score standards to ensure a representative number of them and foster a diversity of views in classrooms. This is one of his, polls, right, on the one hand. And then he says it is racist to assume a Black student was admitted to school via racial preferences and racist to expect them to represent the diverse view in classroom discussions. And so here I'm wondering, because again, let's talk about safety and education. Let's talk about the importance of being able to get a high school education, a college education, whatever, without any of this stuff.
But hold on, before we go there,
Please,
let's
please.
let's talk about the fact that these practices happen to white students all the time. Can we just admit that? Can we just talk about the fact that there are millions of graduates of Ivy League schools who are subpar? Can we talk about how there are so many legacy students in these Ivy League schools who have been bankrolled their way into the school and bankrolled their way out of the school, who have had their grades adjusted? This is a common practice. This has been happening for years, for decades. I would even say for centuries, if we're talking about these old established schools. So why is it okay for white people to do it, but it's a problem when it's done for students of color?
Well, I don't think he's against affirmative action on the one hand. I
We're
think,
not talking about affirmative action, though. We're not talking about affirmative action,
well,
right?
I
Because
mean, how,
affirmative
how,
action,
however we tailor it, I am 100%. I believe that McWhorter's concern, right, and he raises the concern um, on this topic are Black students who don't have the chops well served? I think your question is as important, which is, are white students who aren't at level well served by being let into an Ivy League school, right? Whites. So this is a whole nother area, which is
yeah.
we have such a massive socioeconomic divide in this country that a student who goes to this a private school here in Buffalo, who is a hockey player, who is a legacy at both that school and whatever college he or she might go into,
Mm-hmm.
is going to be as much behind the eight ball when asked what McWhorter's questions about the Plato's Republic as a student who comes from a sub-performing school on the east side of Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
So those two students are going to be in the same boat. But as you pointed out, the only student we seem to care about is the African American student.
That's it.
right? Because the white student is taken care of, because even if they perform subpar at Columbia, it doesn't matter because their safety net is built into their lives.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
so,
And
so,
I'm
so
not just,
McWhorter's solutions, are yes, more vocational school, but I think what you're offering is, wait a second, let's get students who come into this school a different level of attention. I saw this at Middlebury back in the dark ages when I was at Middlebury, where students who came from different socioeconomic backgrounds, regardless of uh, race, regardless of were were encouraged to do, a preparatory week of school to get them uh, acculturated to the college campus life.
yeah, yeah.
And in that, we're also encouraged, we're reached out directly with academic support for that. Now,
Hmm.
Middlebury is not a community college. Middlebury is a high performing 4-year liberal arts school.
Yeah, it's up
So,
there.
so with a sense that if we want diversity, then we have to follow it up. We can't just throw the students into class without support.
But that's on the back end. What McWhorter talks about is on the front end. He's saying that standards are being lowered so that black students can enter, which I don't see any evidence of. And again, I don't have access to volumes of research like maybe you might, or the time to look through it. But from what I have researched, I don't see that at all. In fact, I see the opposite of that. I see that black students who enter, who are applying to these schools, are often held to a much higher standard. I've seen more instances where black students are denied more often, even though they are at on the same level or even higher than their white
Well,
counterparts.
and certainly we are seeing that now that admissions has gone off the deep end, right? So
Well,
in this year where affirmative action is totally outlawed, we're
yeah,
seeing a significant drop in minority students being admitted to class of 2028.
which I find interesting that the people who are most adversely affected by this is not African American, it's Asian American. Uh, and so you have
Well,
Asian, yeah, well, this is again, I read this article in the Atlantic where their Asian students, where Asian parents, Asian families are up in arms about this because the admission level for Asian students has dropped like 10 to 12%, which is very significant. And they're upset about it. And I kind of see it as, cutting off the nose, just cutting off your nose to spite your face. It just, you don't want certain people in your school, but at the same time, you cut off the people who, right, they had nothing to do with it. The issue is with black students or whatever. The issue is against immigrant students, not the Asians, but now it's the Asians who are catching all the heat. And you see the same thing played out in the housing market, where HOAs were formed to keep black residents out of the neighborhood, but then who else gets left out of the neighborhood? The people that you actually want. So,
so I want to go back to what may be our guiding light through some of this, which is an attempt for simple solutions to complicated problems.
let's
Um, and also a resistance to potentially simple solutions to complicated problems as well. Because, one of the things that, we can talk, I want to talk eventually about McWhorter's 3 solutions, but
yeah.
uh, on the question of guaranteeing student safety,
Mhm.
we have African American students who, like you, suffered, again, violations of personhood on a much greater scale and much more often than white American students. Period. End of story. I think that's real. I think it's same for Hispanic American students. I think it's same for uh, Asian American students. Right now, it's the same for Jewish American students, but Jews don't count for diversity, so it doesn't matter. We're all many of us are already white, so no one cares, and we're Jewish, so we deserve it. So, but that's another story altogether. Um, More importantly, in all of this, we have white students also asking for safety. Only the safety is confused because when an African American student talks about microaggressions as opposed to violations of personhood, and microaggressions, as you said, as laying the groundwork to violations of personhood, because of, and again, this might be our central critique of McWhorter's book, because of the fuzziness of the critique, because of the inexactness of it, we end up with white students having a claim to safety for other reasons, like they don't want to be in a class where Huckleberry Finn is discussed
Exactly. Exactly.
because the N word is in Huckleberry Finn, and a white student shouldn't have to hear the N word.
Or be allowed, or not be allowed to say it if it's in an academic pursuit. I've heard that too.
So, and of course, on top of all of that, then there are controversial speakers who are not allowed to come to campus
Right.
because somehow or another, the freedom of speech is abrogated by the need for safety by students on campus. So
Right. Right.
here is, I mean, and this may be the central plank of my particular perspective on this,
Mhm.
um, which is I feel like when we stray inexactly into, and I think McWhorter agrees with this, into illiberalism on the left, when we aren't making it clear about the real danger of microaggressions to a person's a central essential personhood, a universal personhood of a person, then we allow illiberalism on the right and to rear its ugly head and say, oh, well, if you don't want to hear that, I don't want to hear this thing either. And it's the same.
Right. Right.
And we're not having good discussions about why. We're just saying, and I think if we want to look at McWhorter's sort of Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, Ta-Nehisi Coates critique, it's the reflexive knee-jerk, you can't say that because it's racist. You can't think that because it's racist. You have to reform yourself because it's racist without a why,
Right.
without a
Right.
for what.
Right. Right. And I think what McWhorter does is he does highlight the extremism that has accompanied this anti-racism movement. I will give him that because all of the instances that he speaks of are very extreme cases. But I don't believe you can just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because you have extreme cases of something doesn't mean that the whole entire thing should be nullified. I don't think that you should stop being an anti-racist just because you got a few anti-racists who consider themselves prophets and gods of a new religion. You know what I mean? You cannot stop the fight. And, to talk about Ibrahim Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and to prop them up, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and prop them up as these larger than life figures, and then and not to mention the work that they've done, just because there are certain people who latch onto them and treat them as prophets and gods, is sort of, it's a straw man argument. It's like, okay, you have some extreme people who take this and run with it, but what is it that they're running with? They're running, this is the work. Ibrahim Kendi talks about doing the work. Now, of course, that work is difficult and it might not be the best thing to do. It might not be the best choice. There might be something better, but it's still work and it's something that we all have to do. And so Robin DiAngelo says it as well. She's like, yeah, she writes a book for white people, but at the same time, this is work that should ultimately benefit everybody, not just Black people, but everybody. The country must heal. And in that healing, there has to be some restitution. There has to be some reckoning with white people and also a reckoning with Black people. And if every time we try to move toward that restitution, we cut it off because it's not right, it's not this, not that, then the work never gets done.
So, so you've highlighted a key element here, which is McWhorter's reading of those three particular, prophets of this orthodoxy.
That's an awesome term, by the way. Prophets of orthodoxy.
Uh, and it is that they may not necessarily promote the entirety of the extremism that he is reading.
Right.
And, Yasha Monk points out that one of the essential aspects of all of this is an overturning of optimism. That
Mm,
that mid 20th century anti-racism work, civil rights work, was optimistic. That
mm,
that even at the end of both Malcolm X's and Dr. King's life, both of them were wed to the idea that changing the system would be more effective
mm.
than tearing it down.
Yes. Yes.
And uh, and regardless of the historicity of whether or not the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are worth saving,
Mm,
and um, certainly by the time Lincoln reinterprets them,
hmm.
and Lincoln, of course, not 100% wonderful figure either, but
Right.
by the time Lincoln reframes both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution so that we have three central amendments to the Constitution that do attempt to redeem it. Um,
Right.
so we have a really post-Civil War Reconstruction Constitution that's, by virtue of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, very different from the Constitution beforehand.
Right.
But what we see is, and with King's often, I would say, overused line about the arc of the universe bending towards justice, I
Uh,
mean, not without a heck of a lot of work by us. There's
hey,
no bending of that arc without us putting
that's
our
right.
backs into it.
We're bending it.
And, but it's not something that's going to happen on its own. We've got to do it. But in all of that, there is a sense that we can make it better. And we have. And I think this is, McWhorter's deep question here is that he feels that this orthodoxy, this can't it publicly admit progress, right?
Mm,
We can't say that we are better off in 2020 than we were in 1970.
right. I can completely understand. I completely agree with it. And I have often grappled with that as well. Is how far have we come? This is something that in the Black community we talk about a lot. We say, well, man, we've come so far, but how far have we really come? Because we're still fighting the same battles that our ancestors fought. We're still fighting the same battles that Dr. King's generation fought. So how far have we truly come? So I completely get that. Yeah.
And it's slow going, right? Mother
Yeah.
Jones didn't live to see the Union victories that were done in her name,
Right.
right? Susan B. Anthony and the majority of the original suffragists didn't live to see the 19th Amendment pass in 1920.
Mm.
Uh, and slavery was 300 years.
Yeah. There are people who fought to end slavery that never saw the end of slavery.
There are people and their great 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 grandchildren who fought
Yeah.
against slavery who never got to see it
Never
unended.
got
And to this day, you are related to people who had grandparents who were slaves.
exactly. I have people in my family who remember hearing stories about slavery from their great grandparents.
Right. So we have gone from generations of such incremental progress to
Mm,
generations of so much progress that we still feel it's not enough for good
for
effing
good,
reason.
right. Um, yes, this reminds me of something that I read, and if I can remember the man's name who wrote it, can't think of his name, but he wrote an article. Um, this was right after Trayvon Martin was killed, right before the Black Lives Matter movement sort of jumped off. He was writing an article, and in the article, he was talking about something that his grandmother told him. He grew up in Memphis. No, he grew up in Mississippi. No, it was Memphis, Tennessee. He grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and his grandmother was talking of, because he, again, she's one of those people who remembered her grandmother talking about slavery, what it was like to be a slave, what it was like to be free. She told him when he was younger, she said, you know, white people, when King and them started marching, that white people kept saying, you want so much, you want too much too fast. You need to go slow. Why do we have to rush these things? And she said the truth of the matter is, these are her words, not mine, but she said the truth of the matter is, if white people really wanted to end racism, it would be done. She said white people ended polio, they sent a man to the flipping moon. But you mean to tell me this one thing, the simple matter of treating people as equals, they can't do. So there has to be something that stopping that. There has to be something that white people are happy with that makes it so difficult to really tackle race. And
Well, and
when white,
Pastor Hughes, I think this is, you've hit the nail on the head really beautifully here with
yeah,
this, which is there's one thing for working for incremental change within the system based on an understanding that what's happening is absolutely wrong.
exactly.
And another thing for saying, oh no, it's moving too quickly.
That's
No, no,
it.
no.
That's
That's
it.
that's not okay. It's not
No,
okay
it's not.
to say you don't get fundamental human rights.
Right.
That's not okay. There's no acceleration that is fast enough to
That's right.
get our neighbors equality of rights.
That's
Period. End
right.
of story.
Period.
There's an understanding that changing the system to make that happen may take time. But
Yeah.
if we're dragging our feet because, oh no, equality is too much too soon. No, forget that.
Right.
And I think again, part of the, what you so beautifully, divided out there and articulated clearly is that there is a resistance in, let's call it the white supremacist nature of American society, regardless of McWhorter's denigration of white supremacist being, this now uh, unspecific curse word.
Uh,
Uh, but there is, right? There is
yeah.
there is a
Sure.
bedrock in the even more in the there are multiple threads in the warp and woof of the tapestry of American society that are fundamentally white supremacist.
Mhm.
And
I
pulling them out is going to take time, but identifying them as wrong should not be a question of patience.
exactly. It should not be a question of faith. And I think, and that right there to me is why we have this wokeism nonsense to begin. This is why Black students are requesting safe spaces in college. This is why, you know, uh, this is why CRT was created. This is why people are reacting negatively to CRT. It's because we let this sit for too long. We've let it sit for too long. And until we until we wake up and I said that intentionally, until we wake up and realize that these practices are wrong and that they should stop, we're going to keep having these problems. It's going to keep happening. It's going to keep bifurcating. It's going to keep dovetailing into something bigger and bigger and bigger until we realize and recognize that the stuff is wrong and stop trying to justify it. What bothers me so much about racist people and white supremacists is that they try to make bad things normal. They try to say it's okay. No, the Confederate flag is about Southern pride. No, it is not. It has never been about Southern pride. You are trying to justify racism. You are just trying to do wrong. That's wrong. And
So, so
instead of us saying as a nation that is flipping wrong, we say, well, they have a right to express themselves, which they do. They do have a right to express themselves, but we also have a right to respond. It's all about, okay, freedom of speech. I can say what I want. Yes, you can. You can say what you want. You can do what you want, but that should not stop us from saying you're flipping wrong.
Well, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom to be unchallenged.
Exactly. We should be able to challenge. If I want to go cut the head
But I
off of a
think,
Confederate
but
soldier statue, I should do that.
but what you just did really is you redeemed the reason for the anti-racist backlash is the recalcitrance of white supremacist America,
Right. Right.
right? So that
Right.
why do we have sort of this frustration from um, whatever McWhorter identifies as this woke racism, orthodoxy? We
Mm-hmm.
have it in large part because white America is so damn recalcitrant about it, right? So, however, there what McWhorter is maybe in fact calling for, welcome Nanette, nice to see you, is is a greater effectiveness in this. Because
Yes.
I think Ibram Kendi's original call, right? The original call from How to Be an Anti-Racist from Ibram Kendi was not, and I would say the original call from Robin DiAngelo, whom I've also read and respect,
Mm-hmm.
because of course McWhorter takes issue with them all,
Yes, he does.
is is that first of all, it does take work, and it is consciousness work in
Yes.
order to do this. And consciousness work is personal self-growth on the one hand, but
Right.
both of them are asking for policy changes that make real difference. And 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 I think in the backsliding, uh, reactionary, uh, anti-progress of the last 15 years, really since the Tea Party movement, we've seen uh, white supremacist America take on voting, take
Mm-hmm.
on, um, you know, equality under the law, take on, you know, corporations and the right to give as much money as you want for whatever cause, take on the administrative state of the United States for the sake of pulling America back into a minority rule society.
Mm-hmm.
And in this, there is therefore an understandable frustration among all of us who have been pushing for deep internal change in ourselves to be coupled with organizing for progress externally.
Right.
And in that frustration, we latch on to the idea if only we can get everybody to say the right thing, then it'll be better.
Exactly. Something that Dr. King said that I've never forgotten. And he said it like this. He said, the problem with America is a moral issue. But the thing about morality is inherent in every person. Whether you choose to be moral is a choice. And so you cannot change a person's mind. You can only change your own mind. And so what happens is we who are in this anti-racism work, or we who call ourselves liberal or whatever, liberal work on the left, we are trying so hard to change people's minds. Dr. King said, people will criticize Dr. King. They said that, you're trying to shuck and jive for white people. You're trying to show who to white people that you are a human being. And he was saying his response to that was, no, I'm not. We are not shucking and jiving for white people. We are being human beings for ourselves. The white people have to choose to accept us as such. And if they don't, that's their failure of morality. If that means that they have no morality, you cannot appeal to a person's morality who has no morality. You cannot appeal to a sense of justice to a person who has no sense of justice. So, we try so hard to change people's minds and we never can. We can't change people's minds. They have to make that choice for themselves. And so what we're trying to do, which seems futile, which I'm now, as we're talking through this, I'm getting a little bit of what McWhorter was saying. He's saying that we're putting all this effort into changing people who really cannot be changed. So the policies that we are supporting and that we are voting for, that we are spending our money on, they're just band-aids. They're just band-aids. And anytime you put a band-aid on, you're not healing the wound, you're just covering it up. And when the wound is covered up, that gives the people an opportunity to morph and change. Racism is around still because it's been allowed to change and morph and adapt. Because we really can't change their minds. We can only change their behavior. We can make it illegal. We can make it, punishable, but that's not going to change who they are as individuals. And so we can tamp it down. We can suppress it. You can't say this. You can't say that. You must do this. Okay, fine. But that's still racist. That's still
So,
racist.
so we're gonna open up this conversation in a minute, but I want to end our non-participant, our not yet open up part on conversation of what I think are the most salient points that Professor McWhorter makes, which are his three practical recommendations. So his
Uh,
three recommendations for excellent. Thank you for setting that up with no editorial comment. So his three recommendations are: number one, legalize all drugs for the sake of cutting into the prison industrial complex, right? So that if we cease having so many people unfairly in prison because for trumped up drug charges, then we will have a lot more people in the Black community. So that's number one. Number two is return to reasonable phonics education for, he says, for all majority minority schools, but I would go further and say for all schools. I think our reading education has sucked when we abandoned phonics, and I have seen it personally with my own child who required my spouse to actually go through phonics with them in kindergarten in order to actually get them to read.
Books
So
don't always work for me. I'm sorry.
those two, and then number three is a return to advocating for vocational education. That success in America does not mean going to college. So those are his three suggestions. We're going to give Reverend Hughes. We're going to give you the chance to talk about that first, and then we're going to invite everybody else in because I have. Nanette Massey asks, "What is phonics?" So phonics is the method of teaching kids how to sound out words. So, and it has been replaced in a lot of schools by an unscientifically justified, I would say, and of course I don't have any opinion about it, totally stupid idea um, that kids will learn how to read merely by recognizing the whole word as opposed to sounding it out.
It's
So
not scientific. It can't be scientific.
So
It's just
no,
it's
it's been proven ineffective
exactly.
in dozens of studies over the last 20 years.
Oh my
Yes,
gosh.
Nanette, that is stupid. All
It's
right.
so
I think we may have lost our child-friendly rating for this week. But so quickly, Pastor Hughes, in a couple of minutes, what do you think of these three suggestions?
I'll take the last one. I'll take the last one first. Um, Especially for the Black community, but maybe even more so for the American for the nation. I think moving away from higher education as the central uh, platform for success needs to happen. I think there are so many other ways that we can earn a living. You know, uh, and again, this goes back to history. There was a time when in high schools they had shop class. You could learn how to be a mechanic. You can work wood turning. You can do welding, and these things provided you with the means to provide for yourself. When you graduated high school, you were in a position to be a journeyman or an apprentice, or to even be a master in a short amount of time. You could become a master mechanic, a master carpenter, any of these things. And these things paid the bills, right? It paid the bills. They took these programs out of school and they pushed everyone towards the higher education model. And then, because of course, they didn't really want certain people to go to school, right? They didn't think certain people were smart enough to go to school. But then when those people began going to school in large numbers, then they moved the goalposts again. It's okay. Then they made schools higher, more and more and more, tuition is more and more expensive. So these are all just tactics to keep certain people out of institutions of higher learning.
Well,
And
and worse than all of this is it means that we actually do not have the workforce that we need for modern society.
that was my next words exactly. Now you don't have anyone to work these jobs. You know, you got HVAC people who, I mean, I know I have a friend in Arizona. He's making six figures right now because he's an HVAC technician. And it took him 15 years. He has his own business now. And he got people to do it for him. Because he decided he's not going to go to college. He says, I'm going to learn to do a trade. He learned a trade, and everybody gave him so much trouble for it. And now we who gave him trouble for it are paying off student loans, and he is not.
That's right.
Okay.
So,
And he's
so
making a living for himself. Okay, so that's the third. I like that.
So on that, by the way, I put a book in the chat called "The Tyranny of Merit: What's Become of the Common Good," and it's Michael Sandel, who is a very interesting philosopher and writer and professor at Harvard, which may or may not be a good thing, but he actually takes on Obama's sort of party line on everybody needs to go to college very squarely in this. And so, yes,
Yeah.
okay, I think we can
Okay.
all agree more vocational ed is a good
More
thing.
vocational ed.
Look, we found something that McWhorter said that we like.
Yeah, man, I love it. I love it. 100%. Okay, this whole thing about education, I agree that phonics is the best way to go, but that's not a solution. That's not a solution. It's just not a solution. Okay. If you really want to talk about education, let's talk about standardized tests. Let's talk about the cultural bias inherent in standardized tests. But that's so much more
So
complicated.
what if we take the phonics idea as a seed of the beginning of a new national educational process, not standards, but process?
Right, not standards. Right, standardized tests is the mistake that I think we make with our education system. Right. What is a standardized test? It's anyway. We don't have.
Standardized tests are, look, let's dismiss standardized tests in the quickest possible way, which is by saying that every standardized test still derived from the IQ test in the early 1900s that was deliberately designed to show that white people were smarter than black people. Period.
Exactly.
End of story. It is a racist
It's so great.
intent from the outset. Okay,
Yeah.
so
So cut that.
so phonics good, better education better.
Better.
Now, get rid of the new Jim Crow, the prison industrial complex, by legalizing all drugs.
Which is not good. Okay. That's not going to work. That is not a solution. That is not even a long-term solution. Okay. It is not. Decriminalizing certain schedule, certain tier drugs could possibly impact that. Yes. This whole, legalization or decriminalization of marijuana has kept a lot of people out of prison, and it actually got people out of prison that really didn't belong retroactively. So yes, for that, but just decriminalizing all the drugs, no, that's not going to work. That's a
Well,
problem.
and I'd like to at some point we should go deeper into the cannabis question because right now there's a huge black market for cannabis, and there is recent coverage of the fact that the Chinese are using legal growing places
Yeah,
in some states to then undercut the high price of taxable uh,
yeah,
marijuana in other places. And because nobody speaks Mandarin, they're not even using codes for communications anymore. They're just using Chinese. So there's a
yep.
whole nother question. So this is a longer conversation. Okay, let's
Conversation.
invite everybody in because it's so great to have so many of our wonderful regular participants here.
Yeah,
And
our
if
troublemaker.
we so you're welcome to come off mute and start your camera. I've given you the opportunity to do that. And I want to thank you all for supporting us. If you are interested, anybody who sees this or hears this in helping out Accomplices for Justice, you can find us at www.opendoorjudaism.org. That's Open Door Judaism spelled normally.org, one word. And you can join some of the people here who have already done an amazing job supporting our work. We have a three this is part one of 3 parts this month. This one on woke racism, the next one on this book, A Thousand Small Sanities, which we've set up very well
Oh,
today
Adam
by Adam
Gopnik.
Gachnick. Yes. And the third book hasn't even come out yet. We are anticipating its arrival. It's by Mary Anne Franks. It's called Fearless Speech. All of that is on my regular emails. If you have any questions, let me know. Meanwhile, Tay, Allison, Barbara, Nanette, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Barbara, you have a question.
I don't have a question. I have a couple comments.
Please.
Okay, solution number one, that's stupid. Solution number two, teaching phonics. I can attest to the importance of that. First of all, reading is the basis for, I mean, if you can't read, you might as well forget it. And even for vocational training, if you can't read. So I've been doing, it's called Reading Buddies. I volunteer twice a week with a school in Philadelphia, and I read with second graders. And these are kids that are struggling with reading. I have no education background. The teacher, and now it's 3 different second grade teachers, just let you, you choose a book, you have the kid read, and then you help them learn how to read. And I use phonics. They don't tell me not to use phonics. And these kids, I've had comments at the end of the year from the teachers where they'll say, "Oh my God, Miss Barb, if it weren't for her, I don't think my kid would have ever learned to read." So it is, I mean, I believe in it strongly. Secondly, vocational training. We recently, some Quaker ladies met with Tom Carl, who's running for Congress in the 23rd district. And he was talking about the importance of vocational training. And he said, we are led to believe that all of these American companies go over to China because they don't have to pay as much. He said, much of the reasons for them going over to China is that China has this wealth of technically trained people within just a very, very short radius, and that's the reason that many of our companies go over to China.
Yeah.
And I also have a nephew who struggled through high school, and he ended up being a electrician through the, he was a journal electrician, and he makes more money than he owns 2 homes. He makes more money than I could ever dream of making when I was working.
And thank you for your responses, Barb, and for your comments. I think what's very interesting is it's again on the simple answers to complicated problems, and some of those answers actually work and some of them don't. The notion that it was law enforcement changes and drug enforcement changes that got us into the prison industrial complex doesn't mean it's the way out of it. And I think and I think that oftentimes we say, oh, this was the cause, get rid of the cause, we'll get rid of the problem. So I think, thank you all for those comments. Tay, Allison, Nanette, or Pastor Hughes, you have another response?
No, I was just saying that 2 wrongs don't make a right. Go ahead, Charlotte. I'm sorry.
Yes, Tay.
I'll just quickly say I agree very much with Barb about a lot of the things. And Nanette knows a great deal about equity in education. I've talked with her about that, and you can get her to talk about that very much. And I could talk on for 10 minutes about my experiences with my grandkids versus working with pre-K and kindergarten students as a volunteer and so on. But Barb, I think, hits it pretty well on the nose. And you're right about at least phonics first, and then sight reading comes after they can work out. And that's what my granddaughter has already learned, and she's only 4. She can read chapter books like a second grader. So anyway, third grader maybe. But
And of course, you're not biased at all because your grandchild must be the smartest and most brilliant person ever.
Well, no, but I know the advantage she has. Her mother can afford to be a stay-at-home mom while she's working on her PhD, but you know, et
Please,
cetera, et cetera. And it's an advantage that,
I support your particular
yeah,
bias.
but
My 10-year-old is definitely the smartest 10-year-old ever.
yeah, but all the same, the other kids should have that same advantage. Well, I'm wonderfully that we're getting more and more into pre-K for all. Um, so kids can start learning when they're 3 and 4, because I know at least with foreign languages, they say, well, second languages, let's say, not foreign, second languages, that kids who've learned a second language before they're about 5 or by the time they're 5 are better at language learning. And I would guess that the same kind of thing happens if they've had experiences with reading when they're 3 or 4. It's going to make them better at it all the way along, and so on. So universal pre-K, I think, is wonderful. The school that I'm retired from just started having pre-K for 3-year-olds, not just 4-year-olds. Now,
Wow,
this school,
that's great.
these kids are also pretty privileged, so that's one thing. But one thing I'll just tell maybe just a fun story, but interesting, and I keep thinking about, okay, I may have mentioned this before, but I don't think so. I have a great-great-grandfather who was a very active abolitionist. You know, from a very privileged background in many ways, he was a math professor in the like 1830s, but was told by his college, he and 2 others, that you have to stop being an abolitionist or you have to stop being a math professor. Parents, when they see your letters to the editor, aren't going to send their kids to our college and so on. So they all left and became active abolitionists. But after the Civil War, this is what fascinates me. He was very supportive of his daughters. In fact, one of his daughters was very tech savvy, and he and his daughter made actually a calculator, and it's in some museums, some examples of it. They designed a calculator in, I think, the late 1870s. Well, anyway, the point is that when it came up in his big abolitionist group after the Civil War to promote, let's see, voting rights for Black people and for women, all in one thing, and that's what his group wanted, he actually moved on into a different group that only supported it for Black people, because he believed that if you put the two together, it would be rejected, because people didn't want women to vote. They didn't mind if Black people voted. And he was very supportive of his wife and his daughters, but he felt that if they were put together, it was the women that would ruin everything. So put the women's votes off to the side. And that fascinated me, that he would say that, but it might have been true even in those days. I don't know. But anyway, that's
Thank you so much, Tay.
probably enough.
Allison, did you have a comment or a question?
Yes, I'd like to speak to 2 things briefly. One is vocational education. We work on that in Africa too, because in Kenya, inherited from the British, is the universities the only way to go. And so it was really hard to convince people that, gee, you could do a lot in carpentry, you could do a lot in plumbing, etc. So we're still working on that. Now here, if we do emphasize vocational education, there's a lot of training needed for the guidance counselors and the teachers, because there has been in the past saying, oh, well, if they don't qualify for college, then send them to vocational.
Yeah.
And that's where the BOCES thing came from. But BOCES is improving, I think. And I hope that there will be training for those who advise students which way to go.
Well, and Allison, what you point out is really so important, which is this idea that there shouldn't be a stratification. There shouldn't be a sense that, oh, I'm not high achieving enough to go to college. Rather, hey, I have a different, I have attributes and tendencies that make me want to do a different work than sitting in a classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have a son who, you know, is a very physically active guy, and he has accepted, because of his preferences, that he's going to be in school for a long time. That's not something that he got from us. I mean, he lives in a household with a lot of books and, and a lot of talking about this sort of stuff. So he may have got it from somewhere, but his preferences are not mine, right? He wants to go forward in hard sciences. He says, I know I'm going to school for a long time and I'm okay with that, right? But to have a student who says, hey, wait a second, what I really like is fixing things. And so, we know somebody here in town who was playing with his car throughout the last couple of years of high school. He went to school for as an aviation mechanic.
Yeah.
And so there are options. And so I think that's, and if I want to end, and we need to end because of course we all have places to go, and we really appreciate all of you being here. I want to end, for those of you who don't know, it's an interesting time of year to be Jewish.
Yes.
Tonight is Erev Rosh Hashanah, the first evening of
Rosh
the
Hashanah,
Jewish New
right?
Year. And if I want to offer all of us a blessing, it's the idea that options are at the core to human rights. That what we need to figure out how to do, and why Reverend Hughes and I have talked about living with soul. Well, living with soul means, in Adam Gopnik's words, and we'll talk about it next week, reducing cruelty to the best of our abilities on one hand, and on the other hand, I think providing options, and that those options should be the best that we can offer to the maximum number of people. And that that those options should not be distinguished because of different people's backgrounds. We should offer as the fullest menu of options in life. And with that, I wish all of you a 5785, which is our next Jewish year, starting tonight, of options and wholeness and well-being. May it be a better year for us all. Thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
True.
Rabbi Freirich, would you please be sure that I am on the invitation list?